famous scientist once said that there is a four-dimensional space-time continuum in which anything that happens anywhere at any time is represented by a point. The sequence of such points, or events, form a person's world line. The people and events on this world line are all connected to the life of one man, and this is his story. It is a world line dotted with an illuminating convergence of events. A line in which scientific discovery intersects with artistic creativity. A life traveled by a man with the mind of a scientist and the soul of an artist. A world line that is still continuing its journey. This world line connects the life of inventor Professor Igor Gamow with his father, George Gamow, the renowned scientist who originated the Big Bang theory of the universe. George Gamow was born in the fabled Russian city of Odessa on March 4th, 1904. Odessa was home to many generations of Gamows. George's father, Anton, taught Russian literature at a private boys' school. One of his most talented students was the young Leon Trotsky. As a boy, George often trudged down the Odessa steps to fetch water from the Dniester River and haul it back to the house. George was a precocious child. By the age of 7, he was reading Jules Verne and dreaming of a trip to the moon. George's grandfather, Arseny, was the metropolitan, or head priest, of Odessa's cathedral. In 1854, the British attacked Odessa, and the city was evacuated. Father Arseny was escorted out of town by the Russian Navy and took with him the church's most sacred icon.
As I heard the story, in the middle of this process, all at once he had a bout of diarrhea. And it was probably from God. And so there was one remaining sailor there, and he said, could you just watch my things, and I'll go behind the fence. And so he took off his icon, and he took off his big robe, and he put it all neatly down, and he was squatting behind the fence. And a shell from one of the boats came and killed the sailor and destroyed everything on the dock. And the only thing left was this golden icon. And not only that, one of the fuses from the shell was embedded in the hand of Jesus. I was invited to the 95th birthday of Father on the Black Sea, and it was wonderful. I mean, I never drank so much vodka in my life, and it was sausages, and my Russian language came back again. And at some moment I said, there was an icon that my father talked about, but this is back, this is 150 years ago. And one of the physicists, he said, well, we have that. Would you like to see it? And I said, of course. But I thought the cathedral, where it was completely destroyed during the Second World War by the Nazis. He said, that's true. But before they destroyed it, all the people in Odessa came and took all the different valuables and hid it from the Germans in the various cellars. And after the war is out, they built a new church. We'll take you. So ceremoniously, about 5 of us got in a tramway, went to this wonderful church. It looked like it's been there for 2,000 years. Walked in, it was dark. And at the far end of the church was a stairway. And you go up the stairway, and there's a couple of people in line before me, and they would go up there, and sure enough, behind the glass was this icon. And people religiously kind of kissed the glass, and looked at it.
After the Russian Revolution, the study of physics began to flourish again in Russia, In 1923, after a year at Odessa's Novorossa University, Gamow decided to attend the University of Leningrad.
When I was in Odessa, I was actually sitting in the spot where Father's house was and where he was born, which is now a parking lot. And to celebrate that, we had to go to the neighbors and get a bottle. We had the vodka and get some glasses, and we could celebrate that because the building is no longer there, but kind of the spirit's there. And then I've heard all these stories when I was in Odessa, how Father, after he finished his elementary school, or I guess high school, went for 1 year to what is now called the University of Odessa. And there was only really one physicist there. And he knew right away that he needed to go someplace else. So he arrives at the University of Leningrad after a very young man. He was enchanted by relativity, but how did he manage to find himself with probably the best of all people in the world to study with in this particular topic? Was that just by a coincidence?
You could call it a coincidence. It is a very fortunate conjunction of events. You're right. In Odessa, at that time in the early 20s, the civil disruption, the civil war, result of the 1917 revolution was in full swing. So it made the academic enterprise a rather uncertain undertaking. And he had heard that in Leningrad that Abraham Yoffe had resurrected physics, and in particular quantum mechanics and relativity, which is really what even today, these are the two bulwarks of physics. So he decided that he'd like to go to Leningrad, and in fact his father sold a large fraction of the family silver, which to me demonstrates a high degree of confidence in the capacity of their only son.
At the University of Leningrad, Gamow met the brilliant mathematician Alexander Friedmann, whose radical theory that the universe was expanding would ignite Gamow's lifelong quest to establish the physical model for the origin of the universe. Gamow would eventually develop Friedmann's formula into his own monumental Big Bang theory. Based on Einstein's general theory of relativity, Friedmann mathematically formulated a theory that the universe was not static. It was a revolutionary new concept in cosmology.
Friedmann's was a mathematical, like Einstein's, it was a mathematical model of the universe. Gamow put in physical reality, put in nuclei, and was able to develop Friedmann's mathematical model into a concrete physical model.
In the summer of 1928, Gamow's professors at Leningrad University recommended that their star pupil spend the summer studying at the German University of Göttingen, which was then at the center of the developments in quantum physics.
The first thing that George Gamow did in science, he was 24 years old, and he had just arrived at Göttingen, which is the cynosure of the development of quantum mechanics at that time in 1928, was to apply the theory of quantum mechanics, which was precisely 2 years old at the time, to the atomic nucleus. This was a most adventurous step, because quantum mechanics had been applied to molecules, atoms and molecules, and collections of molecules up to that time. It was a tremendous success once Schrödinger and Heisenberg had invented quantum mechanics. But nobody had dared apply it to the atomic nucleus. The atomic nucleus was a terra incognita. They hadn't a clue about its structure. Bohr thought that quantum mechanics might not even be applicable within the nucleus.
J.J. Thomson's watermelon model was the first attempt to describe the internal structure of the atom, in which the atom consisted of a positively charged substance with negative electrons embedded in this continuous positive charge like seeds in a watermelon. In 1911, the British physicist Ernest Rutherford bombarded the atom with electrically charged alpha particles. The deflection of the alpha particles proved that the positive charges within the atom were not distributed uniformly, as in the watermelon model, but concentrated at the center of the atom's nucleus. Rutherford also discovered that when he bombarded the atom with alpha particles, they failed to penetrate the nucleus. Gamow developed the quantum theory of radioactive decay to show how particles could escape the atomic nucleus.
He was probably the first even to seriously consider that the alpha particle might be a subconstituent. Quantum mechanics was a wave motion. The particles behaved like waves. So he thinks of these alpha particles inside the nucleus, and they behave as waves, and they can seep out of the nucleus. Seep is a peculiar term in this case because they come out extremely rapidly and extremely frequently. But on the scale of nuclear time, on nuclear time scales, it was seeping out. And he applied it, and he immediately, there's a famous rule, the Geiger-Nuttall rule, which described the connection between the time it took alpha particles to get out the nucleus and the energy of the alpha particles, and he found it immediately. It fitted perfectly. Couldn't have been better. This is a tremendous breakthrough. And even though quantum mechanics have been applied to the atom in similar situations, it's the absolute daring of Gamow's theory that marked it out as something completely different.
By the fall of 1928, Gamow's studies in Göttingen were officially over. On his way back to Russia, Gamow decided to stop for a day in Copenhagen and try to meet the legendary Niels Bohr.
He had often heard about Niels Bohr, and so he decided to take a small side trip to Denmark, to Copenhagen, to see if he could see the great man Niels Bohr. Well, he talked to the secretary, and the secretary talked to Bohr, and Bohr told her, he says, well, I'm a little bit busy now. Could you have the young man come back tomorrow? And my father told the secretary that he really hadn't enough money to stay in Copenhagen another day. So Bohr then came out, talked to my father, and was very impressed with him, and immediately said, I think I can arrange for you a fellowship. And father ended up in Denmark, in Copenhagen, with Bohr, and father had bought himself a BSA motorcycle. And I've heard all these stories that father was teaching, in a beautiful picture of Bohr riding my father's motorcycle with Rutherford yelling behind that he had to get off the motorcycle and chastised my father, and he said, if you kill Bohr, it will put physics back 50 years.
George Gamow and Niels Bohr shared a passion for going to Western movies.
Another story of Niels Bohr and my father in movies, again demonstrating what a realist and a practical person Bohr was. Because they walked out of this one movie, and Bohr very seriously to my father said, I do not understand. How come when you have the man in the white hat and the man in the black hat ready for a shootout, who would draw first? It turns out the man in the black hat always draws first. But the man in the white hat is faster. And Bohr said, how is that possible? And my father should have said what Alfred Hitchcock one time said when somebody asked about an inconsistency in one of his movies. He said, it's a movie. It's a movie. But Bohr was very bothered by this, and he came up with a theory. He said, perhaps the white hat, acting reflexively, is even faster than a person who is thinking about doing it, because thinking, that process, may actually slow you down. And I don't think my father took it very seriously, but Bohr did. And so they went out, and I get something equivalent to white hats and black hats and cap guns, and they set up the experiment. And as father tells the story, Bohr killed us all.
When George Gamow returned to Russia in 1931 to become a professor at Leningrad University, he found that the Stalin regime had stifled academic freedom. The study of quantum mechanics was branded capitalistic science and banished. Gamow was selected to present a paper at the Conference on Nuclear Physics in Rome, but the Russian embassy denied him a passport. Max Delbruck read Gamow's paper at the Congress. Gamow received a letter of condolence from the Congress. Among those who signed it were Madame Curie, Enrico Fermi, and Wolfgang Pauli. It was a sign of the high esteem held for George Gamow among the international scientific community. At the passport office, George met a beautiful young physics graduate named Lyubov Bokminzeva. Her nickname was Ro.
They were at a travel agency or a passport office because my father was trying to get a passport, and she happened to be a graduate student there for a business deal, and they were sitting next to each other, and my mother was smoking a cigarette and having a palm up. My father was sitting next and rather abruptly took my mother's, future mother, other hand and looked at her palm. And he said, "That's extraordinary, because in my father's palm there are two lines which go down here and they do not cross." And that happens to a number of people. But in father's other hand, you have two lines that do not cross. And so he was curious about my mother, future mother, and it turns out, Ro, my mother, her palms, her lines didn't cross. And so, in one sense, my birth and my whole existence was a function of my mother's palms. And as my father had described to me many, many years later, that I was a genetic experiment, because the first time he saw me as a baby, when the nurse brought him in, the first thing my father did was look at my two palms to see if my lines didn't cross, and they did not.
By 1931, Gamow and his wife Ro began planning to escape the repression of Stalinist Russia.
They were trying to figure out some way to get out of Russia. And father realized, with my mother, while looking at the map and all the borders in China, etc., that perhaps the best way is to go into Turkey. And here you had the Crimea and the Black Sea, and was only 170 miles across the Black Sea to the Turkish shore. That ought to be a piece of cake. And so my father and my mother concocted that they would take a little kayak boat, and maybe they could go across. And so they went with, I think, 2 pounds of chocolate and a bottle of brandy, and they thought they'd take them 2 or 3 days to do. And of course, when they started, the Black Sea was very calm, but then the wind came up and they were tossed around, and they were blown completely offshore, away from their destination, and ended up actually, not too many miles away, 50 miles away, but still on Soviet land, and rescued by some fishermen. Everyone was a little suspicious of them. The chocolate they had eaten, and the rescuers, the fishermen, apparently absconded with the brandy, and that was sort of the end of the Crimean campaign.
By 1933, George and Ro were still looking for an opportunity to escape Russia. Fortuitously, Gamow was appointed to attend the Solvay Congress held in Brussels. Bohr, Curie, Schrödinger, Pauli, Dirac, Fermi, and Heisenberg were all there. It was a who's who of modern-day physics. Russian officials allowed Gamow to take Ro with him as his secretary. The Gamows never returned to Russia, and in 1934 made their way to the United States. Gamow was invited to join the physics department at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and accepted on the condition that they hire his friend, Edward Teller, who would later go on to become the father of the H-bomb.
Joe Gamow was one of the really few people whom I call a good friend. Not one of my memories of Joe is other than pleasant. He liked to live, he liked fun, and he liked to make people have fun. And furthermore, science, physics was his life. It was a peculiar physics. It was a qualitative physics. Practically no mathematics in it. Gamow was fantastic in his ideas. I want to tell you how we worked. I like, and even at that time I liked to live late. At the crack of dawn, I mean at 9:30 in the morning, or meaning even at 9 o'clock already, Joe Gamow would call me almost every day with a recent idea. And that idea was simply wrong. Almost always. Joe Gamow had the wonderful property that he did not mind being wrong. He did not do it for prestige. He did it for fun. He did it for love. And when his idea was not wrong, it was not only right, it was right and new.
On November 4th, 1935, Roe and George had their first and only child, their son, Igor. In 1941, 2 weeks before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Gamows bought a new house on Thoreau Street in Bethesda, Maryland. Igor was 6 years old. One, Two, Three, Infinity by George Gamow is considered one of the greatest science books ever written. Gamow's inscription to the book reads, "To my son Igor, who wanted to be a cowboy." While his father was busy working on the Big Bang theory of the universe, Igor was busy riding horses.
When I was a teenager, young teenager, I was doing rodeos, kid rodeos. I rode bareback bronc. Also did some calf roping at the age of 15 or something like that, or 14. Come. Back, 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 up, up. What's more? Up.
While Igor was busy being a cowboy, his father was busy being a world-renowned physicist.
I was never very impressed with my father. He never really seemed to do much. He sat in his study. He discussed with various people like Alberts, Einstein, and Oppenheimers, Robert and Frank, and Edward Teller, about what's happening inside the stars. He taught at the university, but he only left the house twice a week, on Tuesdays and Thursdays to teach his 2 courses. But mostly he was home. But he didn't seem to do anything. You give up on me? Have you given up on me? Have you given up on me?
Although young Igor wasn't aware of it at the time, his father was hot on the trail of his most important discovery. At George Washington University, Gamow applied his discoveries in nuclear physics to evolutionary cosmology. He was attempting to describe nothing less than the creation of the universe.
When Gamow developed the Big Bang, he thought of it as, he called it the hot evolving universe theory. The word hot means that the original constituents, which nowadays are thought to originate probably in some kind of quantum fluctuation, in some ways, the development of the quantum fluctuation which results in alpha decay, or also an emission, what they call cold emission of an electron from an atom. It's the essence of quantum mechanics, is quantum fluctuations. So they think that even in the very large, and on the scale of the entire cosmos, that the idea of a quantum fluctuation makes sense. So many people today are happiest with the idea of thinking of the Big Bang, so-called, as being a quantum fluctuation in which maybe the universe went from some other phase into the phase in which it originated, and subsequently evolved in what we see in the universe today, which, by the way, is not the way we look at it here. Things are very comfortable for us here on Earth, but that's very providential.
Speaking of whimsical enterprises, Max Delbruck, in a memorial volume dedicated to Father, presented a paper called Out of This World, in which he describes a paper written by George Gamow and Rosenfeld in 1931, entitled On the Determination of the Velocity of an Object Moving in a Fluid on the Basis of a Single Photograph, 1931. That paper, submitted to Physica, never got published. It was a hoax, a wonderful, elaborate hoax. Father and his colleagues went to a beach one day, and while Pauli was coming in from the water in his bathing suit, Father took a photograph. And later he saw that the photograph, as he was walking, there seems to be some waves around his legs. And so he decided, well, maybe we can calculate the velocity of this object, Wolfgang Pauli, walking through the water by a little bit of hocus pocus in mathematics. So first he takes the photograph, then he takes the diagram of the photograph, and then he calculates all these different lines. He does a bunch of mathematics, and voila, he's got a velocity. So he and Rosenfeld submit this paper to a journal, a serious journal. The editor of the journal was Ehrenfest, a very serious man. But instead of just saying, but science is serious, Joe, and turning it down, he analyzes it. And his biggest criticism of the paper was he wasn't quite sure it was rejected only for this reason. But if you look at the diagram of the photograph, you have various different lines, and one line goes through the crotch. And so Ehrenfest nicely writes, possibly the committee was also influenced by the linguistic difficulty which one senses immediately if one tries to logically, in a precise way, to define in any modern language the position of point A prime, which is so critical for the whole method. So Ehrenfest turns the joke around on them, and I think his joke is probably as good as Father's joke. The idea of being an amateur, I think, is absolutely, every time you change fields, you kind of start from zero and begin again. But the playfulness that he got paid for doing science reminds me of a story that I think I read in a comic book when I was a boy of the great pitcher, Bob Feller. And he was, I think he could pitch, 130 miles an hour a ball and, through a small hole. And when he got his first job, they were paying him, $30 a day. And he just could not believe that he was being paid to play baseball. I mean, it was just, just hard to believe.
He was a shameless skimmer. He did all the good things, and then he looked around for another field to work in. He didn't take himself seriously. I think he innately felt that the image of an expert, portentous expert, was preposterous. He, in all his popular works, or his commentary on physics, that is an impression that is you cannot avoid getting from. He didn't like that picture of himself, I think it has had the effect of people thinking that he doesn't take himself seriously, so we shouldn't really take him so seriously. And this work can be improved and formulated and presented in a more scientific way, which is completely erroneous. But I think that's the reason for why people, many people do see him today as quite underrated when you consider the amount of innovations that he made, not only in physics, also in astronomy, and in cosmology, and even in biological genetics. Gamow made a tremendous contribution to the genetic code, and again, as I mentioned earlier, it was his formulating the question rather than he produced a very coherent answer to the question, but the most important contribution he made was addressing that question. And the provenance of this story is very interesting. He was visiting Berkeley from George Washington University in 1953, and Louis Alvarez, who won the Nobel Prize for his work in hydrogen bubble chambers later, was coming down the hallway with a copy of the British scientific journal Nature, and he said, "This is wonderful, look at this stuff," to Gamow. And it was the paper he was referring to was the Crick and Watson paper on the double helix. And Gamow agreed with him. It was, "This is wonderful." And he looked at it and took it off and thought about it for a while. What Crick and Watson had done was they'd built a model of the DNA molecule, and they concluded from analytical and X-ray evidence and other types of evidence that the structure of the molecule was a helix together with another helix, a complementary helix wrapped around it. The helix consisted of constituents, or 4 basic constituents, the nucleotides. I'll just use the letters A, C, T, and G. So 4 units, and this provided a mechanism for the transmission of the genetic information. So Gamow looked at this, and like everybody else, this is obvious. It's an alphabet. This could be the secret of life. But it immediately occurred to Gamow that he says, we're not made predominantly of chromosomes and of nucleotides. We're made mostly of proteins. And he knew enough biology. He was not a biologist by a long shot, but he knew enough biology to realize that proteins are made out of constituents called amino acids. Now, as far as I know, there are many amino acids, but Gamow believed that there were probably only 20 amino acids involved in biological systems. And he even drew up a list of these. And he sent it off to Crick and Watson at Cambridge, at the famous Cavendish Lab, where they had done this work on the double helix. They used to do a lot of their creative work within the hollow precincts of the Eagle Pub, which is close by the Cavendish Lab. And this letter arrived, I think it was brought in by Crick, and Crick had opened it up, and then he was having lunch with Watson there, and he said, look what I've got here. He said, another crank letter, I suppose. And he said, and he was just about to file 13 it, and he says by somebody called Gamow. And Watson made a comment. Yes, he says, wait a minute, I know him. He's a crackpot, but he's a genius. He's a famous cosmologist. I just met him about 2 weeks ago in Berkeley. So it was retrieved from the trash can, and they looked at it closely. And Crick says, he says, could he be right? Only 20 used? And he said, right there, I amended Gamow's list to formulate the list of 20 amino acids, which is still today, to the present time, considered to be the constituents of the proteins. And then he looked at Gamow's idea. Gamow, how could an alphabet of 4 supply information which would then be rewritten in an alphabet of 20?
Father came up with a beautiful mathematical idea based that Father was really a pre-revolutionary Russian, more in the spirit of Lermontov, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky. And these pre-revolutionary Russians all had 3 passions. One with ladies, one with horses, and one with cards. Father, as far as I know, never played a game of cards, but he was fascinated with the magic of cards, and at every party would do card tricks. So when he first read the paper in 1953 by Watson and Crick, and he said, there are 4 nucleotides where you have 4 suits in the cards, and you want to take something 4 at a time, or maybe 3 at a time. And Father immediately, by instinct, Father had very good instinct, thought the code must be a triplet. So a question came, can you take 4 things, like the 4 suits of a card, 3 at a time, and how many combinations would you get? Father also knew that there were 20 amino acids in a protein. So the coding problem was a triplet with 4 nucleotides. So Father started with his deck of cards, and these are the original deck of cards he used. He said, well, what if it's all 1 suit? Like hearts, 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 diamonds, 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 clubs, 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 spades, spades, spades. How many sets do you have? We have 4 sets of triplets. On the other hand, if you use a different card in each triplet, like diamond, heart, spades, how many would you get? Using the same analysis, you get another 4. That's interesting. But the third possibility is that you'd use 2 the same and 1 different, like heart, heart, spade, diamond, diamond, club. How many would you get? Well, if you do the experiment, you get 12. And that is just fantastic. 12, because you have 4, 12, and 4, and you get 20. So Father was ecstatic. Everybody around Father was ecstatic. It was so elegant. It was so beautiful. It turned out to be dead wrong, but it was absolutely beautiful. But it stimulated so many people to think about the coding problem. And finally, Marshall Nuremberg, using biochemistry, solved the problem. And it turned out that the elegant method Father proposed, which was a catalyst, will stay in history as the most elegant, wrong explanation in science.
In 1947, when Igor was 12 years old, his parents enrolled him in Stanton Military Academy in Virginia. The Academy's brochure said, "Send your boy to Stanton and make him a character." Young Igor was all for it. He spent 4 years at the Academy, shooting rifles, riding horses, and chasing the local town girls. In 1951, on a visit home for Christmas vacation, Igor met the daughter of one of his father's graduate students.
His older daughter was named Ildiko Maria Gabriela Ivera Polvari, who escaped with her father from Budapest and was a dancer, a dance student there in Hungary, and continued her dancing in the Washington Ballet School in D.C. I was completely smitten by her and wanted to spend more time with her and her family. I asked her one time, innocently, to go to a dance performance, Jose Greco, flamenco dancing, downtown Washington. It changed my life. Before the evening was out, watching Jose Greco, the ladies in the long skirts and the castanets, and of course Greco himself with his gorgeous high-heeled staccato feet. I was just overwhelmed. By the end of the performance, I had decided that dancing would be the center of my universe.
Igor left Stanton Military Academy and moved home to be closer to Ildiko and pursue his newfound passion for dance. A year later, in 1953, George and Rose separated and sold the family house in Bethesda. Rose moved to Berkeley to work with Edward Teller, and George moved into the Cosmo Club, an exclusive men's club in downtown D.C. Igor dropped out of high school and moved into a one-room cold water flat on O Street. For the next 5 years, Igor pursued his passion for classical dance and supported himself with 2 rather adventurous jobs: the daredevil life of a motorcycle racer and as a motorcycle courier.
Now, motorcycles have always been in my blood, and I didn't quite realize why. But my dad, George Gamow, back in Copenhagen, back when he was working with Niels Bohr on the nature of the atomic atom, he had a little BSA motorcycle. And everywhere he went, this is back in the 30s, he was famous for his motorcycle. When he was in Copenhagen, Denmark, with Niels Bohr, befriended Edward Teller, who's now known as the father of the H-bomb. And so the 2 of them toured all Copenhagen with Edward sitting in the back and father with goggles on the front.
Early in 1934, I believe, we had a peculiar little enterprise. Gamow took me along on his motorcycle for an Easter holiday. I remember it because it's the only way ever that I rode on a motorcycle. And we rode all over Denmark. And I want to make this point very clear, it's important. I felt very safe. Gamow was fantastic in his ideas. He was right, he was wrong, more often wrong than right. Always interesting. But as a driver, he was more cautious than anybody I ever knew. I remember being on the seashore with him and discussing physics, not in the way of a real expert physicist, not even in the way of my physics. It was Gamowian physics.
Now, at that time, back in the 50s, every big news organization depended on a series of motorcyclists who were most elegant bunch. They all wore riding boots, always shined, jodhpurs, black leather jacket, white scarf, and a big press sign. And so there was about 12 or 13 of us, and I got the job with CBS News. My first assignment was to participate with the journalist and the photographer with Easter egg rolling Eisenhower on the White House lawn, because it was Easter. And there was Grace Kelly. So I thought, jobs can't get better than that.
Riding a motorcycle and rubbing shoulders with the likes of Grace Kelly made for a great day job. But Igor's real passion was ballet. In 1907, the Russian choreographer Michael Fokine created a radical new style of ballet with exciting new choreography for men. In 1909, the renowned dancer Vaslav Nijinsky went to Paris and created a sensation with his performance of The Favorite Slave in Fokine's Scheherazade. It was the birth of modern ballet. Michael Fokine's nephew was the great ballet instructor, Leon Fokine. Leon was raised in the court of the Tsar, where he inherited an aristocratic elegance and sophistication. Luckily for Igor, Fokine came to Washington, D.C. and started the National Ballet Company. It would become Igor's new home.
So for 5 years, I studied with Leon Fokine. He became actually my full-time guardian. We traveled together. My world revolved around ballet. Now, I have a good ballet background in one sense. My parents, when they were in Russia, would go continually, weekly, if not more, to various ballets, sometimes re-seeing the same ballet over and over again, like Swan Lake. And so actually ballet is in the soul of all Russians, both my mother and my father. Father, after a few years, he hadn't seen me, came to Washington, and I wanted him to see one of the rehearsals I was doing. And it was early morning, it was probably 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock in the morning, and we were rehearsing. I was doing the Bluebird variation out of nutcracker, in which I'm covered with all blue feathers, and it's a beautiful variation, and it's a pas de deux. So here we are practicing, and it's pretty athletic, and the music is playing, my father is sitting there watching, and I finished the dance, I'm huffing and puffing, and father, instead of telling me that he was really impressed of how far I had progressed in my dancing, or it reminded him of something in Russia, he said, I noticed when you were doing these double turns in the air, tour en l'air in French, that the perspiration was coming off your body and the sunlight coming through the window caused refraction and a rainbow. Oh, I thought, wouldn't you know, I would have to have a father who was a physicist. But Dad, how was it? How was the dancing? Fokine was a very, very elegant dresser, a fantastic teacher, a very good guide for being a guardian. But I don't know how many times in class, halfway through a class, or maybe about a third of a way through class, when he's whistling and sort of going along, but he was always impeccably dressed in a suit and a bow tie, that he would, at one point, always dramatically stand, take off his jacket, then reach up, undo his bow tie, open up his collar, and then he would be the Fokine of teaching. One time, after maybe 2 or 3 years with Fokine, he got a phone call from a studio who wanted to have a teacher who would come and teach one of their advanced classes. Her name was Beatrice Hammond, School of Dance in Washington. And so Fokine asked me if I would do that. That was, of course, a great honor. And then he said, but Beatrice Hammond wanted to know whether I would have difficulties with black students because her studio is completely black. And I said, no, of course not. I taught there for about a year when Beatrice Hammond came to me and said that they're going to give a recital / performance, and would I, for pay, I think it was like $200, consent to be the lead dancer, actually the only male dancer. And I said, yes, of course.
They were performing Scheherazade, in which the Sultan's wife frees his favorite slave and tries to seduce him. Igor played the lead role of the favorite slave.
They put liquid mascara on my head and pancake makeup because I was dancing bare-chested. And it almost worked. I'd say almost worked because I perspire a lot, and during the first performance, the liquid mascara was pouring down my face. You actually couldn't see it from the audience, but every time I went to the side, people took a towel and were bathing me off. But I think the fact that I was dancing in a black company as a white person, which is the only black role in the ballet, and was kind of backwards, was sort of very unique. And I look at that experience with that beautiful, beautiful, wonderful company with so much fond memories.
In 1956, at a party at Leon Fokine's, Igor met the renowned ballet dancer Igor Yuskevich. The next day, Igor attended Yuskevich's performance of Swan Lake.
And the performance was perfect. The music was perfect. The lighting was perfect. The dancing was perfect. But by the time they finished, I realized that ballet would not be the center of my universe. This was not because I realized that finally I could not be as great a dancer as Igor Yuskevich. I knew this from day one. That really was not my goal. But probably more importantly, that I realized that I loved the process of ballet, but I didn't like the establishment of ballet. I realized that after this wonderful performance, Yuskevich and Alonzo would take off the makeup, would take off the costumes, put them in big trunks. Everything would be hauled out to Greyhound buses. They would go to another city, to Baltimore, and that night reverse the whole process, and again, it would be an anticlimax. And so at that point, I think it was the next day, but I sent a telegram to my father and said I would actually accept his offer he made, but I would leave Washington and join him at CU, the University of Colorado. He became their professor just the year beforehand. And he made a deal with me. I couldn't refuse. He said he would pay my tuition, what turned out to be, in 1957, $80 a semester. And he would also give me a stipend, a living stipend of $137 and some cents a month. I said, why some cents? He said, well, it's the fine structure constant in physics, and it turns out it's not an integer. And I said, well, all right. When Father made me the offer to come as a student to University of Colorado, and the stipend he would give me, and the tuition he paid, I decided I would do that. And so I changed my life. I cut my hair. I sold my wonderful, beautiful Indian chief, got into my little MGTC racing car with 19-inch wheels, and I and my German Shepherd Kim went from Washington, D.C., cross-country in the middle of winter, actually passing through Kansas City, because I had a girlfriend from a few years before, Jessica Benton, whose father was Thomas Hart Benton. So I spent a few days with them, and then continued on to Boulder, Colorado. In contrast to my experience in Washington, in contrast to my experience even in Kansas City, Boulder looked so sterile. And I just felt completely out of place until I met one man, Stan Brakhage. And Stan Brakhage was just a breath of fresh air.
Stan Brakhage will go on to become America's most famous avant-garde film director, making over 400 films that helped shape the evolution of cinematic technique. Igor said that Brakhage used the camera as an extension of his own eye.
Stan and I became friends. And at one point, I said, you know, I think I should introduce you to my father. We arrived at the University Club where Father lived, knocked on the door, and I was had forgotten what a disaster it is to have my father meet my friends. Father opened the door, had a big grin, big-ass grin. In one hand, he had a glass of vodka and always a cigarette in the other hand. And so I introduced him. Even before the doors closed, Father attacked Stan. He says, oh, what do you do? Are you a film artist? And Stan was a little taken back, and he said, yes. And Father began to say, oh, a film artist. Isn't it interesting that art is not progressive, but science is? And Stan was a little puzzled, and Father said, well, I'll give you an example. If you take great scientists of the past, let's take Aristotle or Newton, and bring them to this century, they'd be idiots, complete idiots. They wouldn't know anything. They'd have to go to school from the very beginning. But on the other hand, if you take artists, you could take Homer, Michelangelo, Beethoven, Mozart, James Joyce, and they'd be right at home. So science is progressive, and art doesn't change. Stan kind of stepped back and he said, just wait one damn minute. A phrase I've heard him say 100 times. And the debate was on. Father smiled. We came in, we sat down, and we began this discussion on art and science. And this discussion, in one form or the other, lasted for the next 46 years.
George Gamow came to the University of Colorado in 1956. By then, he was considered one of the preeminent theorists in modern physics. Gamow wrote over 30 books on physics and won the prestigious Kalinga Prize awarded by UNESCO for the popularization of science. His books were a tour de force covering the landmarks of modern physics. Igor and Stan decided to make George Gamow's book, Mr. Tompkins Inside of Himself, into a film.
Father, of course, was famous for his three theories I mentioned beforehand, but he was mostly loved throughout the world because of his popular writings, particularly the Mr. Tompkins series, where Mr. Tompkins is a layperson, great curiosity, but not very much knowledge, and goes around asking interesting questions and from knowledgeable people. His books have been translated into dozens of different languages and into at least 2 films, including this one. But in this film, we have Father giving an introduction to his hero, C.G.H. Tompkins, and he describes quite carefully that C represents in physics the speed of light, G is the gravitational constant, and H is Planck's constant.
Oh, hello. I'm George Gamow, and I would like to tell you something about the hero of the film we are going to see. Mr. Tompkins is just an ordinary fellow, a bank cashier as a matter of fact, but he is very much interested in science and is bright enough to understand very complicated theories, provided, of course, given to him in a simple form. He got interested in biology, in fundamental biology. And after reading a few books, listening to lectures, he had a dream in which he was injected into his own bloodstream. Well, that's what we are going to see on the film right now.
Throughout the film, we have Mr. Tompkins and Dr. Streets swimming through the bloodstream. In order to get blood, we needed to have a blood source, so I went down to the local hospital, took out 10 cc's, had 10 cc's of my blood taken out, put a little bit of anticoagulant there, and so then we had my blood, and we did the simplest minded thing in the world. We put a drop of blood into a concave slide, and we were focusing up and down as if the erythrocytes, the red blood cells, are coming by you. And then it worked out really just quite fine, and you see Dr. Streets and Mr. Tompkins swimming actually through my blood.
The same year that Igor made the film Mr. Tompkins Inside Himself, he began dating a charming undergraduate student from Germany. Her name was Elfriede Reger. Elfriede grew up in the small town of Sonnenberg, 200 miles south of Berlin. In 1945, the year Germany surrendered in World War II, she was 6 years old. Intelligent and strong-willed, Elfriede escaped communist Germany, won a Fulbright scholarship, and arrived at the University of Colorado in 1960. She has a vivid memory of looking through the window of a German bookstore in 1959 and seeing the book The Creation of the Universe by George Gamow. 2 years later, George Gamow would be her father-in-law. Elfriede met Igor in a class on invertebrate zoology. She was impressed by his quick wit as well as his skill as a dancer.
He used to dance around a lot still at the time. And I always said I loved his very, very wonderful dancing muscles, these beautiful long legs with the strong muscles. And we used to, of course, go to ballet performances. I had to keep him on the seat of his chair because he always wanted to be out there and or improve this, or he had to cringe when things weren't quite right. But over time, this relaxed, and he could sit back and just, have a good time watching and say, oh, now wait and see this, and wait and this and see this. And now I think we both can thoroughly enjoy beautiful ballet.
Not long after they met, Igor and Elfriede were married. Their good friend, Stan Brakhage, filmed their wedding. Now that she was a member of the family, Elfriede would get to know George Gamow quite well. And for many years, they shared a close friendship.
He was so overbearing. we liked each other very much. We loved each other. And we would joke about this. I would cuddle up to him and say, George, Papa Ido is what I called him, Papa Ido. I wouldn't live with you for 10 minutes. Early on, right, really early on, I also learned that he had a, quote, gut feeling for science. He would look at the world in a special way, in what we would call the Gamowian way. That's actually what his colleagues also called it. He would question it and investigate in his ideas and in his thoughts, and he would have a feeling of what was right, wrong, or how things would work. And that was overwhelming even for somebody who had relatively little background in science. But I really felt this. He loved poetry. Just think of Dr. Zhivago. The Russians loved their poems and poets. So we discussed literature, science. We discussed, of course, Europe. This was not that long after the Second World War, and after actually he had left a world behind and I had left a world behind. So we had a plane of communication that maybe some people didn't have. Little did I know that his son Igor would come very close to him. And I found out and I learned that one can live with these people. And you can live with them actually very nicely and have a very interesting life.
Having lived the bohemian life of a ballet dancer the past 5 years, Gamow at first found college life rather dull.
And I found the university perhaps more interesting, but not much more interesting than the high school. It seemed to be a lot of memorization, and I was probably, if not the worst student in class, I was pretty poor, mostly because first I wasn't engaged, and secondly I didn't attend classes. I did join sort of the art group in Denver again, got hired as a ballet teacher, and so I was teaching and performing ballet and sort of going to university just as an aside. So the university days were sort of boring, but my last year as a senior, Father started telling me a little bit about molecular genetics and things that probably everybody knew, but I didn't know, that you had 4 letters in the genetic code. And I was astounded when Father told me, well, all life, from viruses to elephants and giraffes, combination of these 4 letters. And I got tremendously excited about that. And I got passionate and decided, oh, this is what I would like to do for a living. It seems to be a wonderful life. But here I was a senior with a C- average and the chance of getting into graduate school in order to be able to get a higher degree was virtually zero.
Determined to succeed, Igor spent the next 2 years taking advanced science courses and was admitted to the PhD program at CU Medical School.
Graduate school was wonderful. I was working in molecular biology. I was actually working with phage, and bacteriophage are little viruses which live on a bacterium called E. coli. And I didn't know it at that time, but I was really beginning my love and passion for sensory physiology.
George Gamow suggested to Igor that he pursue his postdoctoral studies with George's old friend, Max Delbruck, the renowned biologist who would go on to win the Nobel Prize for his work in molecular genetics. For Igor, it was a golden opportunity to do research at the Cold Spring Laboratory on Long Island with one of the world's preeminent molecular biologists.
Max Delbruck could be credited in bringing physics to biology. There's a concept that all physicists know, and that's the concept of the model system. And so the idea was, if you wanted to study genetics, you wouldn't study elephants, you wouldn't study raccoons. What would you study? And Max and his colleagues came out, you would study something that would reproduce very, very fast have a life cycle of 20 minutes and produce millions and millions of progeny. And so they started to work on bacteria and viruses. Max was interested to find a model system to understand the human brain or to understand the mammalian brain. But it's too complex. It's like the uranium atom in physics. And so he was hunting around for a simple system. And the system would be that it would receive a stimulus, and then there is some molecular reorganization called transduction, and then finally a response. One analogy that Max liked to say, that if you come to your friend and say, "You're stupid," that information gets to the friend's brain. He or she processes this information and then punches you in the nose. So you have a stimulus and a response. And so he fell upon this one system, came upon this one system called Phycomyces, which is a fungus. It's a beautiful fungus, aesthetically beautiful. It's a long stalk, has a little head. It's a little thinner than a human hair, but large enough that you could hold in your hand. And it responds to gravity. Turn it upside down, it will feel gravity. It responds to wind. Most excitingly, it follows a light source. If the sun is going across the horizon, it will follow the sun. And as it follows, it rotates and spirals on its own axis. And so it always has, it receives a stimulus, and within two or 3 minutes, it responds and goes through a molecular transformation. So this seemed to be an absolute ideal system for understanding the human brain, the simple system. And so Max inspired maybe not hundreds, but at least dozens of different laboratories in the country to study this very gorgeous little fungus called Phycomyces blakeslianus.
Gamow received his PhD in 1967, and the University of Colorado offered him a position as an engineering professor in the aerospace department. Igor was in a quandary. Should he continue his postdoc studies with Delbruck in biology, his chosen field, or go to CU as an engineer? Igor asked Max Delbruck for his advice, and Max said, "Let's go for a swim."
Well, swimming with Max was always an interesting adventure because he swims with a very classical breaststroke. And so the breaststroke, you take a great sweep, and his body would come out of the water a little bit like a dolphin or a seal. Then he'd ask a question, and then he would sink underwater and disappear. So therefore, our communication was mute. And if he had asked a question, I had to formulate an answer, and then he'd come up, I'd give him the answer, he'd listen to it, nod his head, and come down again. And so we did this all across the bay. And the bottom line was that he strongly suggested that because engineers know how to do things and biologists do not, that I should become a biologist in the engineering college. And that actually came to pass. Max was convinced when a physicist joins a biology department, he or she is always worried they don't know enough biology. It turns out they never know enough physics. Physics is the rate limiting step to understanding biology.
Unlike his father, who was a theoretical physicist, Igor was drawn to the world of applied physics and loved the creative challenge of the laboratory. After a year spent researching infrared receptors in snakes, he built a Phycomyces laboratory to continue the research he started under Max Delbruck. In the classroom, Gamow gained a reputation as one of the most popular professors at the university. Students were fascinated by his presentations on bionics, the science of living machines. Meanwhile, in the laboratory, his research led to a series of brilliant inventions in the field of bionics. Igor, along with his students and colleagues, have invented more than a dozen patented sporting and medical devices, such as the magic fluke, the training bubble, the spring-loaded knees, the Gamow breathing bladder, the training bed, the pressurized snorkel, and the popular dog cooling jacket, the Cool Canine, created with co-inventor Justin Wise. And Igor's latest endeavor, the life-size pillow dolls, inspired by his favorite superheroes. Gamow is best known for the high-altitude Gamow bag, the energy return shoe created with co-inventor Hugh Herr, and the golden crutch, co-invented with Olympic gold medalist Diana Golden. As Gamow gained a reputation for inventing unique bionic devices, many top-notch athletes began to contact him. The renowned climber Hugh Herr, who had lost both legs to frostbite, wanted Gamow to design him a pair of feet so that he could run the Boston Marathon.
I had a very famous young climber, very famous, and double amputee by the name of Hugh Herr, who came to me and he said, "Oh, I understand you know something about animal locomotion," because I was doing this in my teaching class. And I started working with him designing artificial feet.
After my legs were amputated, my doctors told me that I'd probably never be able to walk again without the assistance of canes, let alone return to my chosen sport of mountain climbing. My response to these comments of preconceived limitations was to ignore them. I designed several specialized artificial limbs that enabled me to return to my sport of mountain climbing. To climb steep ice walls, I designed feet with spikes to penetrate the ice surface. To reach hand and footholds, I made my height adjustable. I can be 5'4" and as tall as I'd like. I also designed specialized feet to wedge into small rock fissures and to stand onto small rock edges. From this experience, I realized that human physical disabilities can be overcome through technological means. Without my artificial legs, I can only crawl. My dream is that one day technology will free the human race of all physical disability.
So Hugh and I began discussing whether we could take some of the engineering tricks used by animals, particularly animals like horses and kangaroos and antelopes, in which they can store the energy in the legs and be able to increase the forward propulsion. In a more scientific term, people would say decrease the cost of transportation. It will take less energy for a horse to run 5 miles per pound of horse than for a human being to run 5 miles per pound of human being. So we really started combining Hugh's instincts of what is necessary to make a running leg with some of my insights in running animals, and really came up with a very nice model for the running leg. And then according, just as to script, halfway through, Hugh gets an idea and says, "Well, what do you think would we make a shoe? Not a complete foot for an amputee, but a shoe for the, as we would say, for the feeted, instead of a leg for the defeated."
The basic concept behind the shoe is that when the runner impacts with the ground, the shoe stores elastic energy in the sole, and that energy is used to thrust the runner forward to enhance propulsion.
We decided, since there are more feeted people than defeated people, that we would just slide into the field of building shoes. And so Hugh Herr and I went to Nike, and we went to ASICS in Japan, and we have now patents and prototypes for running shoes. So kind of one thing runs into another. And I remember people always saying, "Well, how come your father did all these crazy things?" And he didn't do it on purpose. He was just an opportunist. And people would come to him and give him a question. If he couldn't give an answer, he said, "Maybe that's something interesting to work on." But most of these questions are what children can ask. Like, for instance, where does light go when light goes out? And most parents would say, "Go back and watch TV. Don't bother me about these things."
Diana Golden was 12 when she lost her right leg to bone cancer. But her handicap did not hinder her ambitions to be a world-class skier. She won 19 U.S. championships, 9 world championships, was named Female Skier of the Year in 1988, and won a gold medal at the Olympics in Calgary. Golden had heard about Gamow's inventions in the field of bionics, and she asked him to help her design a new style of crutch that would allow her to realize her dream to trek and climb ice fields in Nepal. In order to do this, she needed a forearm crutch that would also serve as an ice axe and a ski pole. Inspired by Golden's indomitable spirit, Gamow agreed to work on the project. Together, they developed the Golden Crutch. But tragically, Golden's cancer returned, and she died before the invention was brought to market. In the mid-'80s, Gamow designed a pressurized bubble chamber to experiment with athletic performance at various altitudes. He received a phone call from an ex-student who was now a climber.
The previous year, he was climbing Makalu, which I guess is the 5th highest mountain in the world, and his best friend died up there. He tried to get him down lower and lower, and it took him 2 days to try to get him down 1,000 feet, and finally he just died. And he said, if we had something like your bubble to lower him without physically taking him, it's like Muhammad going to the mountain and the mountain going to Muhammad. So he is the one who suggested that the device which we had been marketing for athletes could be used for mountain climbers.
Gamow designed a portable version of his training bubble. In essence, he modified a sleeping bag to become an inflatable compression chamber. It weighs only 4 kilograms. With a foot pump, the bag is inflated and at the same time pressurized to simulate a partial descent, helping lower the level of fluid that can build up in the lungs and in the brain.
I had never even been to Hawaii. I've been across the Pacific. So when DuPont offered to give my laboratory a grant and travel funds to go and test the bag anywhere I wanted to, and Nepal and Mount Everest seemed to be a good place to go.
From Kathmandu, Igor took a small plane and flew into the tiny village of Lukla, elevation 11,000 feet. There, he hired a Sherpa, and the two men began the long trek up to Everest Base Camp.
He took his backpack, which is about this big, and for a month, and he took my duffel bag, which is about this big, threw it on his back, and up we went. You know, morning, noon, and night. We stopped in tea houses. We ate every exotic food, mostly Dalbat. And we ended up in a little clinic where the Japanese first had made a medical clinic for high altitude. And so I spent the next 2 weeks up there doing experiments with the bag, and people would come in with mountain sickness, and then we test them, and it was just heaven on earth. The only downside was the first experience, because while I was sitting thinking this is the top of the world, it was the top of the world, 16,000 feet or something, I looked out the window and I see this parade of Sherpas. The doctor, very solemn looking, another Sherpa carrying an oxygen tank, and this completely unconscious woman who looked like she was a corpse. I said, "Oh no, this is what I came for." So they carried her in, and they ran out of oxygen. And so the doctor said, "Well, let's put her in the Gamow bag." So I said, "Oh geez," and I got a photograph where I looked more sick than the woman. So they put her in, and the doctor had a stethoscope putting on. He says, "She's breathing, she's breathing." And finally, after about 5 minutes at pressurized, when she was actually descended, she opened her eyes, and they said, her name was Heather. "Heather, can you hear me?" And she nodded, yes. He says, "Can you touch your nose?" And so she completely missed her nose. And this went back and forth. But after 20 minutes, she started talking, and she could do her nose and everything else. And so she was there for the evening. And then the next morning, a helicopter came and picked her up and took her to Kathmandu. And then about 2 weeks later, when I was leaving, she was still in Kathmandu and heard I was coming down and invited me to lunch and wrote me just a wonderful letter that the bag had saved her life.
Climbers often succumb to high-altitude sickness, which can cause the lungs or the brain to fill with fluid and quickly cause death. The only remedy is to rush the victim to a much lower altitude, which is usually impossible on Everest. Dr. Sherry King was one of the first to test the Gamow bag with climbers on Everest.
One of them became very sick and had a severe form of altitude illness called high altitude pulmonary edema. He was so sick that we actually feared for his life. We used the bag fairly quickly then into our whole expedition. And I would say, even though we were using it in a clinical trial setting, that we saved somebody's life.
The Gamow bag has become standard equipment in mountaineering, saving climbers' lives around the world. No less an authority than Sir Edmund Hillary, the first man to scale Everest, requested a Gamow bag for a high-altitude clinic. The Gamow bag has been used on expeditions to Antarctica and by U.S. Special Forces stationed in the mountains of Afghanistan. During his expedition to the Himalayas to field test the Gamow bag, Igor had become enchanted with the culture and people of Nepal. He interviewed the exalted Rinpoche, Chokanima, and became intrigued with the philosophy of Buddhism.
I fell absolutely in love with Nepal. I fell in love with the people, the country, the atmosphere, the way of life, the sort of more of a right brain, not goal-oriented, but process-oriented.
Back in Boulder, Igor met Narayan Shrestha, a native of Nepal who immigrated to the United States in the late 70s. Narayan started a program called Helping Hands Nepal that took American doctors and Western medical technology back to his native country.
Narayan, up to that point, had been very interested in medicine, to bring modern Western medicine to the villages in Nepal, which were very poor. And so in Narayan's genius, he was able to arrange high altitude treks for American doctors who would love to go and trek in Nepal, and in exchange he would set up these clinics and the doctors would be able to treat 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 people who would come like grunions from the mountains to be treated.
Narayan wanted to start an educational exchange program with Nepal.
And he had tried to recruit some other professors, but all the professors were a little bit too left-brained to be able to spend their time doing that type of work in the mountains. And I said, no, I'm your man, I can do that. And so in the summer of 1988, we formed an institute called the San Institute, basically to teach about Nepali culture and Nepali language, and also the biophysics of altitude physiology. And so for the next 15 years, I went to Nepal twice a year, usually twice a year, with a group of students and lectured in various hotels in China, in all parts of Nepal. And we trekked and we swam and we climbed and we talked. And this is probably the most interesting 15 years of my career at the University of Colorado.
George Gamow passed away in 1968 at the age of 64. The University of Colorado built a new physics building and named it the Gamow Tower. They also established the Gamow Memorial Lecture Series, featuring world-renowned physicists and cosmologists. Since Gamow's death, new discoveries in cosmology and astrophysics have proven his Big Bang theory of the universe to be correct. Igor Gamow retired from the University of Colorado in 2004 and still lives in Boulder with his wife Elfrida. He spends his time writing, pursuing new inventions, and filmmaking. And, of course, riding his beloved horse, Pegasus.